Edward H. Murtagh was born and raised in the era of the horse and buggy. He lived through the introduction of the automobile and powered flight, 2 world wars, terrible economic depressions in Canada and the United States, and personal tragedies. His sons served our nation, and he left a great family legacy. His story is an American immigration story. Edward H. Murtagh was born in Montreal, Quebec, Canada, on March 2, 1884, to George and Mary Reed Murtagh. At 2 years old, Edward's life was profoundly altered when his father suddenly died at age 24, shortly before the birth of Edward's younger brother George in 1885. Without George's wages, Mary and her young family suddenly had to depend on George's parents for food and shelter. Mary either moved in with or lived close to them. George's parents were very strict with Mary's social life after the death of her husband. Mary, who was still young, chafed under their control and left for New Hampshire, USA, where she remarried. The 2 boys were therefore essentially left orphaned and were bound out to neighbors' farms until they were 18. Edward lived with a family in Sawyerville. We know very little about this period of Edward's life, with only a single faded photo of Edward when he was a boy with a bicycle. At age 18, Edward left Sawyerville and moved to Le Preau in Lower New Brunswick to be with his mother and her second husband, Thomas Riley, whom Edward referred to as Dixie. He worked in the woods there for a while as a lumberjack. He quickly learned the lumberjack skills. The timber industry at that time was physically hard, and it depended on the muscles of men and beast. Many years later, as an old man on a trip back to Canada, he very much surprised his family when he easily went out on a log jam on the St. John River to show that he could still find the key log to break the jam. Apparently, he had not forgotten that skill. Dixie Riley, Edward's stepfather, was a sawyer who sharpened axes and other tools and followed the work crew cutting the woods. While Dixie provided sawyer services, Edward decided he would provide supplies to the people who were working in the woods. Later, Edward decided to leave Le Preau and traveled by himself up to St. John. He first worked as a laborer on the docks of the Winterport when the St. Lawrence River froze over. Though always busy and on the move, Edward had found time to marry Catherine Delaney. They were married in St. Rose Church in St. John on June 19, 1907. There are no wedding photos. This photo of Catherine was taken during the 1920s. Though they worked hard, they took time to enjoy themselves. A train would leave St. John with several thousand people and go up to Gondola Point, where a ferry would take the people across to a large island for a picnic at Rockwood Park. Edward also became a square dance caller at some of these social events. Also, riding the riverboats on the weekends for pleasure was common. For a time, Edward was involved in the breaking of workhorses and renting them out, sometimes with carriages. Decades later, when John J. and John E. Murtagh were in St. Rose Church and were talking to a priest about having a memorial mass said for Edward and Catherine Murtagh, in that it was their home church for marriage and attendance, an elderly man sweeping the floor came over and said, "I knew Ned back then. He had a stable and kept the best horses in St. John." Next, Edward turned to selling food off a horse-drawn wagon. He would buy a wagon load of a single item, and John, his eldest son, would go out front of the wagon and on the streets announcing to the residents that they were on the street in the wagon selling the food. Different horns were used for different foods. For example, he had a special horn that he would blow to let people know that he was selling fish. Sometimes he would be selling strawberries or potatoes that came down the St. John on the riverboats. Later, Edward was offered a position that required driving one of the newly available automobiles. When asked if he could drive to get the job, he said yes, but actually he could not. On the first time out in the automobile, he crashed it into a millinery store window. Although Edward's driving skill at this point needed improving, he learned quickly and became proficient. He eventually drove so well that later on he drove for the Prince of Wales when the Royal was in St. John as part of a Canadian tour. Edward next opened a small store for himself on Paradise Row in St. John. Later on, he opened a store on Prince Edward Street. Edward's son John remembered going around West and East Streets taking orders for food and returning home around 8 p.m. Edward would make up the orders and John, with a horse and wagon, would make the deliveries the next day after school. Later in life, John recalled walking in front of the horse-drawn wagon carrying a lantern so that they could see where they were going. Some orders were telephoned in or mailed in. Most people then did not have their own transportation to bring home food. Edward had acted as a middleman, buying from farmers and storing vegetables in the basement of the store by covering the vegetables with earth. It was a standard practice at that time. The Depression of 1920 hit Canada hard. The economy of Great Britain did not recover from World War I. Canada, especially New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, with their close economic ties to Great Britain, was also hit hard by the Depression. The U.S., however, had recovered and was prosperous. As a result of the Depression, a large migration from eastern Canada to eastern U.S. started. There were other negative forces also taking place, making St. John City especially economically hard hit. The railroad and lumber industries were in conflict, and as a result, the dry dock workers and the dock workers were out of work. Now, to be out of work was not uncommon for the workers because, as noted earlier, St. John was known as a winter port. It handled the shipping when the inlet ports of the St. Lawrence were jammed with ice. During the summer, the ships headed back to the inlet ports and would not unload as much cargo at St. John. The people would, therefore, be out of work for the warmer seasons of the year. The storekeepers, including Edward, would extend credit until the next winter when the ships arrived again and the dock workers returned to work. But the Depression hit. The ships did not come back. The men remained out of work, and the storekeepers who had extended credit failed. No longer able to support his family in Canada, he decided to move to the U.S. Edward's letter of August 29, 1926, from Framingham, Massachusetts, to his 16-year-old son, still in New Brunswick, Canada, with his family, notes his job hunting frustration, awe of the Boston subway and streetcars, and concern for his family back home. I have not got to work yet. I tell you it is some job to get to work here, especially if you're a stranger. Of course, my age is a good deal against me for to get a job in a store. If I do not get a job in a store in a few days, I am going to look for something else. When you are on the elevated train, you can look into people's houses 3 stories from the ground, and those trains travel some fast too. Well, John, is times any better in St. John yet? I suppose Arthur and Mary will start to school tomorrow. How is dear little Bussy? I would love to see him. Kiss him for me, John, and do not let him forget his dad. Are you still able to live on $10 a week? John, try and sell that awning over the shop and that old sled for whatever you can get for them. When Edward arrived in Massachusetts in June 1926, he had not seen his younger brother George in 24 years. Edward had learned that George came into the Framingham post office to pick up his mail after work. While waiting at the post office, Edward saw a coin on the ground. Picking it up, he saw the initials GM on it. There, standing in front of him, was a man. Edward asked him if he knew George Murtagh. The man answered that he was George. His brother made him welcome, even though he had not seen him in 24 years. His brother arranged for Edward to get a job with the A&P Tea Company, where he became a manager and often was assigned to help manage other stores on a temporary basis. Edward's oldest son, John, came down from St. John a year later. Then Catherine followed with the rest of the family, daughter Mary and the 3 boys, in 1927 on the steamer Calvin Austin, arriving in Boston with everyone seasick. Edward's wife, Catherine, was a strong-willed woman. When it was time to have her first child, she rowed across the St. John River to see the doctor and have the baby. Catherine noted that she and Edward got along very well. She told her grandson, my father, that they quarreled once, but Catherine whacked Edward over the head with a large iron skillet, and there were no more arguments. My father remembers fondly the Thanksgiving dinners at his grandparents' house. He would arrive early so that he could eat raw turnip before it was cooked. My father remembers that for years he went to Edward and Catherine's house on Beacon Street around the corner from Morris Road, where he lived, and listened to the radio with them on Sunday afternoons. They listened to The Shadow, Gangbusters, Johnny Dollar, and All in the Family. The image my father has of his grandfather Edward was a tall, dignified man, wearing a vest with a watch, chain, and smoking a pipe. The can of Prince Edward tobacco was always by his chair next to the radio. If my father did not come by, they would call over to make sure he was okay. They lived on Lawrence Street, later on C Street, and finally at 192 Beacon Street in Framingham. Months before the start of World War II, Edward, at age 55, became a citizen of the United States. During World War II, all 4 of Edward and Catherine's sons served in the U.S. Armed Forces. All returned from the war, but during this period, Mary and her husband, Nelson Valancourt, and their baby died in a train crash in North Carolina, returning home for Christmas from Florida, where Nelson was stationed in the Army Air Corps. Edward was very close to his only daughter, and this was a very difficult time for him and the entire Murtagh family. In their C Street house, there was a piano at the time Mary died. My father had assumed that it was Mary's, and that was why it was silent. However, many years later, he found out that Edward played the piano often, but after Mary died, he could no longer bring himself to play the piano. Later, in 1954, his eldest son John's wife Leela died of colon cancer. Like Edward, Leela had also been essentially orphaned as a child and was also very close to Edward. Edward's last years were spent quietly with family. He had chronic leukemia and would get a blood transfusion once a month. My father would give blood at the local Red Cross and have the credits sent to Framingham for Edward, and that expedited the blood transfusion process. This was going on for some time, but one time Edward said he felt fine and would skip the injection. Edward's son John told Edward that he was going to be away for several weeks, so he shouldn't skip the injection. Edward and his son went to Framingham Union Hospital, and as the injection was started, Edward suffered a blood clot. One of Edward's grandsons, who was a nurse there, rushed to get a priest, and the last rite was administered while he was still awake. The feeling of guilt hung heavily on John because he had pushed to get the regular injection. Edward lived through a period of great change around the world. During that time, his love for his family and country was constant and unwavering. Edward's influence still resonates through his descendants.